What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop Podcast, where we sit down with top athletes, scientists, experts, and more to learn what the best in the world are doing to perform at their peak and what you can do to unlock your own best performance. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop, and we are on a mission to unlock human performance. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Meeta Singh for an episode on the science of sleep. This is the first of a 3-episode series, which also includes the science of recovery and the science of strain, which are coming soon over the coming weeks. The Science of series is meant to simplify the science behind these concepts, answer common questions, and debunk myths. Okay, back to the talented Dr. Singh, a board-certified physician and psychiatrist with deep expertise in sleep disorder diagnosis, and treatment. So she's worked as a consultant for multiple NFL, MLB, NHL, NBA, Olympic, and college sports teams, as well as for large organizations. The Washington Nationals considered her so vital to their championship in 2019 that they actually gave Meeta a World Series ring. So Dr. Singh sits down with our VP of Performance, Kristen Holmes, to discuss the science behind sleep and what it does for your body, your mind, and your cognitive function. They cover how sleep plays an important role in decision-making and learning, the relationship between metabolic health and sleep consistency, and everything you need to know about sleep debt and how to manage it. As a reminder, you can use the code WILL, that's W-I-L-L, to get 15% off a Whoop membership. Whoop membership includes hardware and software and analytics designed to help you improve your health. And of course, it now includes the new Whoop 4.0. So check that out at whoop.com. Without further ado, here is Dr. Singh.
Dr. Meeta Singh is a board-certified physician and psychiatrist concentrated in the applied science of sleep. Her evidence-based approach integrates individualized medical, psychiatric, and behavioral diagnosis and coaching to improve clients' sleep health, to optimize physical and mental performance, and enhance health and quality of life. Dr. Singh's deep experience in sleep disorder diagnosis and treatment was forged in psychiatry at the Mayo Clinic and as a physician in sleep medicine at the Henry Ford Sleep Center, where Dr. Singh practiced and served as chief of service for 15 years. We truly admire the work Dr. Singh does to provide evidence-based guidance to help folks get the sleep that they need so they can perform to their potential. Dr. Singh, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you.
Well, your work is just insanely inspiring. So, fun facts, Dr. Singh has a World Series championship ring from her work with the Washington Nationals. Meeta, that must have been an amazing journey.
That was an amazing journey. Thank you so much. And I have to tell you, like the most interesting part of that was great teams. They always want to do better. They're there, and then they're competing against other people who are there. So they're looking for that small edge, anything that'll make them do better, and they listen. And that's when it's like a ball that gets rolling, or actually a snowball. When it's coming down the hill, it becomes larger and larger. And as the season progresses, especially the postseason, as they get better and better at what they do, they really want to become tighter and tighter with all the things that they want to optimize. And sleep is so important.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. I mean, when you look at that kind of top tier, the genetics and the skills and expertise, I mean, it's all basically the same, right? The coaching, everyone is tremendous, right? The difference maker is truly in the performance lifestyle, and obviously a huge piece of performance lifestyle is kind of our choices around sleep. So I love that. So to kick us off here, Dr. Singh, can you explain to me why human beings are the only species that deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent reason?
I would say that in the wild, animals, if they were in danger, or if they were, they were in desperate conditions, they probably would not sleep, because they have to be hyper aware and they have to be, they have to be on guard. But for some reason, we as human beings, we do this on a regular basis and we're not in danger. But I think what's happened is that we live in this 24-hour society, right? It's 24/7. We're always on. And especially in the culture that we live in which, Kristen, we're always trying to achieve more. We're trying to make sure, it's like we live in a hustle culture. Oftentimes we feel that the number of hours that we can put in, the greater the number, the better it is. And when we talk further, we should talk about this more, because that's not true, right? Because there's a difference between smart work and working hard, and smart work means you want to, whenever you show up for whatever work you do, smart, good, effective, smart work is a function of a well-rested brain. And we often forget that. That's one thing. And the second thing also is, for the longest, sleep was considered to be optional. It was considered to be something that I'll sleep when I'm dead. That culture was around, and that's slowly changing. So people still have that. And the third thing I would say is that there's also this, when it comes to sleep, especially when it comes in work organization, in large organizations, leadership really can change the culture about when it comes to rest and sleep. So if the leader is sending out emails at 3 a.m, well, that means that they're not getting enough sleep. And if you want to do well, you realize that, well, if they're sending out an email, even if the leader expects the email back, a response back at 6 a.m, if you're a worker who wants to show that you're committed to the company, you send an email back at the same time.
We'll talk a little bit more about sleep and learning and memory, so kind of dig into that. And I'd love to talk to you about presenteeism and chronobiology, so we can kind of dig into workplace a little bit. But before we do that, and we'll also talk about the various systems in the body and kind of what's happening when we're operating in short sleep. But first, I think in order to fully appreciate the strength of a full night's sleep, we kind of need to understand what is actually occurring in our brains from the moment we fall asleep to the moment we wake up. So I'd love for you to kind of talk us through what is happening during this incredible journey we call sleep, and perhaps a bit about why it matters.
So let's start out with what sleep is. So sleep is a normal behavior. It's a normal physiological behavior that occurs every 24 hours. And it's disengagement from the environment, as well as unresponsiveness from the to the environment, right? So, and as far as we know, all organisms at every level show some sort of rest activity cycle. So it's the rest part. And while we as human beings, while we're asleep, because our brains and our bodies are forced into inactivity, rest and recovery tends to occur during that time. And when you ask them what sleep is, they said it's restful. It's when you turn your mind off, etc. And although people look very passive while they're asleep, your brain is very active. And so there are different neurochemicals being secreted, and as the neurochemicals are being secreted, there are different brain waves that are being formed, and it's like a concert. And the brain goes through different stages of sleep, and each stage of sleep is important and serves as a different function. And so in the brain, because there's inactivity, it's like hitting a reset button that happens at night, and that prepares you for the next day. Now, sleep scientists, much to our chagrin, we don't really know what the overall function of sleep is. We know it's really important, right? You spend you should be spending a third of your life sleeping. So unless it serves something absolutely essential, it would be a complete colossal wastage of time. Like, why would you be doing that? While you're asleep, you're vulnerable. You're not doing anything useful. So we definitely know it's very useful. And recently in the last few years, there's been research that shows that while you're asleep, blood sort of rushes through your brain, and your brain gets power washed of all the toxins that have been accumulated during the day. And so that might be a very fundamental thing that happens during this sleep. And so that prepares you for the next day.
Maybe if we can focus on just one aspect. We got a good question from one of our listeners wondering about REM sleep and what exactly is happening during REM and SOIV sleep, and should they be concerned about the percentage of time they're spending in each one? Is there an ideal time? Is the body driving it? What are your thoughts on that?
Wonderful. So let's give a broad overview of what all the sleep stages are. So like I said, different neurochemicals are being secreted and your brain waves look different. So typically sleep, or the state of that human beings are, can be divided into three parts. You're either awake, or you're in dream sleep, or REM, rapid eye movement sleep, or you're in non-dream sleep. Now, non-dream sleep is divided into three stages, going from the lighter to the deeper stages of sleep. Light sleep is N1, then N2, which is slightly deeper, N3 is deep sleep. And when you're falling asleep, you fall into sleep through light sleep, then go into deeper stages of sleep. And during light sleep, your breathing slows down, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure falls. And during your deep sleep, which is an N3 or delta sleep, is where most of the restoration tends to occur. Deep sleep is really, really important because it's important for memory. It's where your muscles are completely relaxed. You're storing glucose, and that's when muscle recovery is typically happening. And then during dream sleep tends to occur in the second half of the night. And during dream sleep, learning and it's important for learning and memory, but it's also important because it adds emotional context to our memory. So every stage of sleep has a certain function. It's not as if light sleep is less important than deep sleep is less important than dream sleep. And typically, light sleep is pretty important. We spend about 50% of our sleep period in light sleep, and there are certain brain waves.
Light sleep, it's a bad rap, but light sleep,
it does get a bad rap. Yes, and then deep REM sleep is approximately 25% of your total sleep time period. Okay. And I would tell people two more things I want to tell them. So first of all, most of your deep sleep occurs in the first half of your night. So if you fall asleep, deep sleep will occur in the first half of the night. Dream sleep tends to occur in the second half of the night because dream sleep is driven by your circadian rhythms. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. And the other thing is that we progress through night in different stages of sleep. So you go through light sleep, deep sleep, dream sleep, and then your sleep lightens and you may actually wake up, and that is a sleep cycle, and it's approximately 90 minutes, and you cycle through these different, you do different stages all through the night.
Okay, so the other thing that I think comes up a lot, and there's perhaps a lot of misinformation around, is whether or not we can catch up on sleep that we've missed, right? So we all have like a base sleep need. Mm-hmm. So maybe, talk about kind of what that might look like for folks in terms of how much time they need to be spending in bed. And then if they're not getting the sleep that they need, and they're accumulating sleep debt, what is actually happening there, and can they kind of catch up on lost sleep?
When we are thinking about sleep, a good way to think about sleep is to think about the quantity of sleep, the quality, and the timing of sleep. So let's first talk about the quantity of sleep, which is what you were saying is sleep need, right? So, of course, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine says for adults, adults need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep to function well and optimally the next day. Definitely, if you get less than 6 hours of sleep, you're going to see deficits in your performance. Mm-hmm. It also changes with age. So kids need more sleep. Babies need a lot of sleep, and as you get older, your sleep requirements slowly reduces. Adolescents still need about 9 hours of sleep. Younger adults tend to need more sleep than older adults. Now, there is there is human, there is variability. So, my sleep requirement may not be yours, but, think about what sleep need is. So sleep need is the amount of sleep you need to be alert and awake in quiet, dull, boring situations the next day, right? So normally when you're, say, sitting down and if you're doing something on your computer, or if you're, listening to this podcast, or, watching a TV, even if the situation is boring and you're sitting, you should be able to keep yourself awake.
Right.
And so
adults shouldn't really feel sleepy during the day if they're meeting their sleep need.
Well, it's not as simple as that. Most times when people meet their sleep need, they should be alert the next day. But alertness varies in a 24-hour cycle depending on your circadian rhythm. So we'll come back to that. So it's not, if you're meeting your sleep need, and if you're well rested at night, when you wake up in the morning, you should, once you get going, you should be alert. In the mid-afternoon, there should be a normal, dip in your alertness, and then you should become alert again. And in the evening, you kind of sort of catch a second wind before your bedtime. That's how alertness varies during the day. That's the definition of what your sleep need is. And I tell people, one way to think whether you're meeting your sleep need is if you feel, well rested during the day, or if you think that you can get by in your day without having to caffeine up, that would mean that you're well rested.
Yeah, that's a good kind of a good marker.
Now, most people have some amount of sleep debt that's going on. So most people, because of all the things we discussed earlier, are not getting enough sleep on a regular basis. And if you get less sleep on a regular basis, sleep debt, which tends to accumulate over time. That's the definition of sleep debt. And the best way to recover from that is to play catch up, is to make sure that whenever you get a chance, you want to sleep in. One way to make sure that you're getting enough sleep is to monitor how much sleep you're getting on a regular basis. So if during your work week, if you get a certain number of hours of sleep, but then on the weekend or your days off, you sleep longer as compared to what you're getting habitually during your work week, that is an indication that you're trying to play catch up. And that means you were not meeting your sleep need when you were on a regular basis. So that would be a good indication to make sure that you're not getting enough sleep.
So in an ideal scenario, we're, going to bed and waking up at a very similar time, and we're, consistently meeting our sleep need. But of course, life happens. So you're suggesting to just extend our sleep when we have the opportunities in order to kind of catch up.
I tell people even small increments help. So, if on a regular basis you're getting 6 hours of sleep, well, perhaps go to bed 15, 20 minutes earlier. Just do that for a little while, because that'll mean a little bit more sleep. And then, once you're able to do that, maybe perhaps go to bed another 20 minutes earlier, or try and stay in bed a little bit longer. And that itself will help without trying to make sure that it's all on the weekend or on your days off.
Right. And I, personally, obviously I just listen to Whoop, so and Whoop does all the work for me. And I'm super alert when I need to be alert. I'm sleepy when I need to be sleepy. So I definitely take advantage, obviously, of the technology.
So let me just intervene that. I mean, and that I think is a great way to use Whoop.
Yeah.
So we live in this society where we really want to measure quite a bit, right? And I would say looking at how much REM sleep you've had or deep sleep you've had, not sure how useful that is, because well, what are you going to do with that information anyways? Like if it tells you you have less REM sleep or less deep sleep, but since stages of sleep are a percentage of the total sleep time, that is really useful information.
Definitely.
So if you wore a device and you looked back at the last 2 weeks and you say, well, every Tuesday night for some reason I get really less sleep, and then and all through the week I'm getting less sleep, and then here's comes Saturday, I sleep in, etc. That's the kind of information that's really useful, because now you can look at trends, you can relate that to the behavior that you've been doing during the day, and then you can take insight from that and make behavior change. That, then it becomes a very useful tool.
Yep, definitely. We did a really interesting study with about 100 CEOs, and we looked at all sorts of parameters, but we're looking at sleep and heart rate variability in relationship to executive functioning. And one of the kind of happy findings in the study is that we were able to see that a relationship between sleep debt, which is basically what Whoop says you need versus what you actually got, that delta actually correlated to next day executive functioning and working memory measured via Stroop and MBAC. So it kind of indirectly validated Whoop sleep need. So it's not just a random number generator. It's actually, if you kind of listen to it, and obviously we're considering circadian factors, there's a lot that kind of goes into the recommendation of sleep need, and it's based on a lot of physiology and science. But it was really cool to kind of see in that study, a relationship. And basically, what we saw for every 45 minutes of sleep debt you accumulated, there was the 10% decrease in executive functioning and working memory next day. So a lot of these CEOs, Meeta, and you work with these folks, right? I mean, they have significant sleep debt. I mean, we're talking for some folks, it's like they're missing their sleep need by 3 hours. So that's like almost 30% decline in executive functioning, working memory. And we saw this, and so I thought, that is crazy. Just meeting that sleep need is so important.
I want to pick on a couple of things that you just said. So something really important: sleep, the effect on performance the next day, any deficits in your physiology the next day occur in a dose-dependent fashion, which means getting 5 hours of sleep is worse than 6 hours, worse than 7 hours. Does that make sense? So which is what you're saying. For every 30-minute increments, the less sleep you get, the worse it gets. And that's really, really important to understand. I mean, that's been shown in many studies. You look at reaction time, you look at you look at accuracy. It's always, the less sleep you get, the worse it is. And the second thing is those deficits accumulate. So if you continue to get less sleep, it's going to get worse. So that's number one. The second thing is, I think this is also a great time to discuss, what executive functioning is, and the components, and how sleep affects it. So think about all the aspects of executive functioning. So making high level decisions, flexibility, which is the ability to change. In the middle of a project or in the midst of a game, when you're telling the coach decides, well, this is not working, this is what I want you to do. For athletes, the ability to say, well, that didn't work, I'm going to switch gears. So that hyper responsiveness, again, function of a well-rested brain. When you don't get enough sleep, that part of the brain that is responsible for good judgment, decision-making, multitasking, high executive functioning tasks, that gets preferentially impaired when you don't get enough sleep. And that part of the brain, and actually there's one part of the brain that sort of lights up, which is your emotional brain. For some reason, it becomes overly active. And so, your decision making definitely gets impaired. You're likely to likely to put yourself in risky situations because your judgment is impaired. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, of course, learning is really important, right? So learning, anything you learn during the day, your brain hits the save button while you're asleep. One of the functions of deep sleep is to prune all this unnecessary information that you may take in and keep or retain that information that is really important. I mean, isn't that you don't want your mind crowded with unnecessary stuff. One of the things you do as an executive is you take in all this information and you come up with these novel solutions. I mean, for example, in the NFL, right? They're watching film, they're looking at what's happening, and then they make decisions based on that. Well, that is creativity. That only happens while you're in your sleep. You take this previously stored information, you put it together with new information, you come up with this novel solution. not getting enough sleep, you make poor decisions. You're not likely to, pick the correct project. You're likely to not score the risk value correctly. And most of all, your emotional intelligence gets impaired. And I think that's so important. So emotional intelligence is just awareness of your own emotions and the ability to name them and then help manage it and to have empathy. All those things that make you a good leader, a good coach. That's, again, it's a function of a well-rested brain. If you don't sleep well enough, you can't really read that. You can't really do that. You can't really read other people's emotions if your own emotional functioning is not, happening correctly. And I think what happens is that because one of the first things that happens is that your judgment is impaired, people's awareness of this doesn't exist. That is why tools are good. So it's funny because if I give somebody a tool, a device, and say, well, I want you to wear this, I want you to do this for about 3 weeks, and they're like, well, I'm getting enough sleep. And then you look at the data afterwards and you tell them, well, not
You're
really.
not.
You really aren't. Because if you got into bed at midnight and woke up at 4 in the morning for a board meeting, there weren't enough hours. So you can't say you got more than that sleep.
Right,
So,
right. So, Meeta, we work with a lot of executives and tactical athletes and healthcare workers, and they really, their perception is that short sleep, I can just remedy it all with some caffeine. Does caffeine improve decision making? Like what's actually happening with that dynamic?
So caffeine is a stimulant. And so to describe what caffeine does, we have to talk a little bit about how it works. Well, one of the things we know really well is that the longer you stay awake, there is a neurochemical that accumulates in your brain, which is like a sleepiness neurochemical. It's called adenosine. And so when it accumulates in your brain, you become sleepier. And what caffeine does is it goes and it attaches itself to that place in the brain where the adenosine is attached. So it blocks the effect of adenosine. So it is pretty effective in keeping you awake because it blocks the effect of sleepiness. So things like your reaction time, your accuracy do increase. So, if you were playing something, a game, if you were, in a sport, it does help in that. The problem is that there are studies that show that it doesn't really affect your judgment. So decision making doesn't get much better. And so, you're just making those bad decisions, but you're just making them faster because now you're all caffeinated up. And then, of course,
that is frightening.
Caffeine does make you a little anxious. Like it may make you jittery. It may make you a little hyper. So that's just one thing that that your audience should be aware of. Yeah, one last thing I'll tell you is that caffeine. Of course, there's variability. Some people are fast metabolizers. Some people are slower metabolizers. Typically, the half-life is about 4 to 5 hours, which means that if you drink, drinking an espresso after dinner doesn't help your sleep at all. And for some people who say, well, I'm still able to fall asleep even if I drink a cup of coffee, what caffeine will do is it will prevent you from going into the deeper stages of sleep. So it'll still impair the quality of your sleep.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and I'd love for us to kind of tack our way through the reproductive, cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune systems, and kind of what's actually happening on short sleep, and how people can kind of develop a framework on, hopefully it will inspire. I don't want to frighten people, but hopefully it will inspire people to really prioritize sleep and maybe recognize where, if there are deficiencies, to really encourage people to get some help. I think it's easy to kind of go through life and deprioritize sleep, and it just seems like kind of this luxury. But I'd love for us to kind of for you to really make a case for why it's absolutely essential, just because it is really impacting every physiological system and body and function
And the simplest way to start is that all the things we've been talking about so far is what happens to sleep in the brain.
Right.
But like we just said, every physiological function is affected. So think about, think of sleep as a nightly reset for your heart. For your reproductive system, for your stomach, your heart, your lungs, every part of your body is taking a rest. Sleep is, for example, very important for immunity. And in the world we live in right now, your immune function is really, really essential. So getting a good night of sleep is is one of your best bets for fighting infection. As long as you do the right thing, like mask up, and you want to prevent physically getting in touch with infection. But it's while you're sleeping that your immune function, your immune cells sort of, there are these really cool cells called natural killer cells, and
assassins.
They get an extra night of sleep and get well rested and are prepared the next day. Also, once you do get an infection, you need sleep for that to be able to fight that infection so that it doesn't progress. That's how it helps immunity. I just love the interaction of sleep and how it affects cardiometabolic health. And so, and I'm going to tell you a story. I mean, just kind of follow along. I know that, in the last 100 years, there's been a steady decline in the amount of sleep people are getting. And at the same time, there's a steady incline in how they're gaining weight, and obesity is increased. And there were multiple studies done in different populations that looked at the association of obesity and sleep duration. And the magic number was that anybody less than 6 hours, 7 hours or less, and especially 6 hours or less, more likely to be obese. And then this was further studied. There was Eve Van Couter and her group at the University of Chicago. They took healthy young adults and they did sleep deprivation studies, in which instead of letting them get enough sleep, make sure that they get only 4 or 5 or 7 hours of sleep over a period of time. And these young healthy adults, at the end of this sleep deprivation period, they were not utilizing their glucose. It was as if they were diabetic. Of course, this was reversible as soon as they got enough sleep. And they found that when people are sleep deprived, they are hungrier. They tend to consume more calories. And when they consume these calories tend to be carbohydrate-rich fatty foods. I mean, they're not craving fruits and vegetables.
Right.
And then, of course, then there is this very interesting relationship with sleep deprivation and what happens to the hormones that control hunger and appetite. And so, your brain, while you're asleep, secretes a hormone called leptin, which is a satiety hormone. Tells you that you're full. If you don't sleep enough, well, not going to be secreted, you're hungrier. Your stomach secretes ghrelin, which makes you hungry. If you don't get enough sleep, you get too much of ghrelin. And perhaps when we were hunters and gatherers, if we didn't get enough sleep, it meant you were in danger and you wanted to eat a lot of food so that you could conserve energy. But of course, now the hunting we do is when we get up to go to our refrigerators to eat.
Yeah.
So there's that. But the other thing, and we haven't talked about circadian rhythms as yet, but the other thing is that all the studies found that impairment in your metabolic control that happens with sleep deprivation is always significantly worsened if you bring in circadian misalignment. Mm-hmm. So if people start sleeping at times which are not their normal sleep times, which happens in, say, shift workers, or happens, like, for example, in nurses when they're doing this shift work, then there is a added impairment in their metabolic control as well as their reproductive health.
Right. And
there's some data that shows that if you're shift workers, there's a higher incidence of certain kind of cancers.
The World Health Organization, deems shift work a carcinogen, which obviously
right. And then what shift work does is there's sleep deprivation, and in association with that, there is that circadian disruption.
So I want to just hang on the metabolic functioning and just in light of your comments around circadian rhythm, because I think that the common advice, of course, when folks want to lose weight is, eat less and move more. Clearly, this is an oversimplification, right? Given everything that you just said about metabolic health and its relationship to sleep. Sleep is where you should start. Actually, a lot of folks come on our platform and they check their motivation for getting onto Whoop is to lose weight. And I think people don't always recognize this really strong relationship between sleep and weight loss and the ability to lose weight. So I'd love for you to talk, I know you know Dr. Sachin Panda out of the Salk Institute. He does a ton of work around time-restricted feeding. And, I think in one of his recent studies, he basically showed that a 10-hour feeding window. So you basically, if you're 10 hour, you only eat during this, you're strict eating, in this 10-hour window, you're fasting for the other, 14, they saw a 3 to 4% reduction in weight, body mass index, abdominal fat, waist circumference, and then two of the key risk factors for heart disease, high blood pressure and high cholesterol also decreased. And then blood sugar and insulin levels improved too, which is not surprising. Right. Would love to get your thoughts on just as a clinician, are you helping folks kind of establish these feeding windows? Kind of how much does that come into your practice?
Well, that, by the way, is a fantastic question. And I'm going to give you a very long-winded answer because I think for your audience, I think we should start out by talking about what circadian rhythms are so that they understand, exactly where we're going here. So remember how what we've really talked about so far is the sleep quantity. And remember I said there's another thing called sleep timing. And so that leads us to what circadian rhythms are. Now, because we live on this rotating rock, Kristen, our Earth, and because we have alternating cycles of light and dark, all organisms, including human beings, we've developed these intrinsic clocks. So these are they're timekeeping clocks, and circadian stands for circa, which is approximately 24 hours. So for us, for human beings, our circadian clock is located in our brain. And it's an intrinsic timekeeping system. But in addition to be intrinsic, it's also on a daily basis. It's reset by exposure to light and dark to wherever you are. So I'm on the East Coast in the US. So when I wake up in the morning, light enters my eye. So my eye, I use my eyes for vision to see things and for light perception for my circadian clock. And light actually hits my circadian clock before it even hits my visual center. And when light hits my circadian clock, it starts secreting an alerting signal. It keeps me awake during the day. And then in darkness, melatonin is secreted in my brain. And that signals my body that I'm ready for nighttime activity, which for human beings typically should be sleep. So that's our circadian clock. And so the clock in our brain is a master clock, but every cell in your body actually has a clock. And every physiological function has a circadian rhythm, which means that during the day it peaks and then there's an ebb to it. For example, your body temperature peaks and ebbs. The way your hormones are secreted, there's a certain time it peaks and a certain time it ebbs. And so your circadian rhythms and your hours of wakefulness, which is your sleep drive, they work in concert together to keep you either awake or asleep in the 24-hour period, right? So when we wake up in the morning, our sleep load is really low because we've had a good night of sleep. As the number of hours awake accumulates, you get sleepier and sleepier, and then you fall asleep at night. And then, of course, remember how we talked about circadian alertness varying. So you wake up in the morning, your circadian rhythms keep you awake, but then in the mid-afternoon, there's like a slight dip, and then again, you increase. So they sort of work in concert. And what Dr. Panda's lab, what they found is that, we, as soon as we wake up, our mouths are open, we start eating, and we eat all the way till we go to bed. And of course, we've already established people don't get enough sleep, and the fact that people are sleeping in, random, their circadian, they're not sleeping in alignment or in sync with their circadian rhythms. And, his data shows that your stomach and your digestive system needs rest too. And the only way to do that is to restrict the time that you're eating. And Of course, he's going to give you a lot more detail about that. But yeah, I recommend that quite a bit. And it's actually very, very useful, especially when you're traveling. So, when I'm working with people and I'm working with jet lag, we talked about that circadian clock, and that circadian clock, of course, light and darkness are the two major Zeitgebers or cues to your circadian clock. But the timing of food and the timing of exercise is also important. And so if you can strategically decide what time to eat and what time to exercise, that can also help shift your clock whenever you're traveling.
So just strategically for our listeners, so basically if they want to create as much synchronization with their circadian rhythms, they want to try to anchor their sleep-wake timing,
Yes.
their regulate their exercise timing potentially, their meal timing. So really kind of find a feeding window that's consistent, and that we're staying within that feeding window. And then finally, really how we're exposing ourselves to light. So,
Yes.
a lot of light when we want to be alert,
Right.
no light when we want to be winding down and calm.
Right. Now,
Maybe,
one of the
yeah.
things we did not talk about is chronotype. And that's important because when we talk about sleeping in sync with your sleep cycle, it's important to
Yep.
be aware of it.
Perfect. And if we can talk about this in the context of presenteeism, I've actually, heard you talk about,
Yeah.
just work schedules and being a night owl versus a morning lark. And yeah, so if you want to kind of dig into that, it would be amazing.
So one of the very important functions of your circadian clock is also is something called your chronotype, which is it's like a genetic predisposition that people have to be either morning people or night owls. People sort of intuitively know whether you're a night owl or you're a morning person or an intermediate. And there are some really good questionnaires that you can use, clinically validated questionnaires you can use, and asking people, like, if you had something really important to do, if you could choose whatever time you could do it, what time would you like to do it, and stuff like that, sort of help you get come to know. So the problem, of course, is that the time that we sleep and the time we wake up isn't really only decided, Kristen, by our sleep need or our chronotype. It's also decided by where we live, what kind of work we do, what time we have to show up to work, whether we have kids, do we have to get them to school on time, do we have to be on a phone call speaking to Asia at a certain time. So all those different things also decided. And because we have all these competing factors, people don't get to bed and don't sleep at the time that they want to. And one of the things actually that happened during COVID is when lockdowns happened and people weren't going to places, they were sleeping more in alignment to their own circadian clocks. They would perhaps go to bed late, and I know that my teenagers were, they would sleep in, they didn't have to wake up at an ungodly hour for them.
And we saw this in the Whoop data too. Obviously hundreds of thousands of folks, right? We were able to see this. Everyone just kind of shifted to their preferred biological preference.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one way for your audience to understand this always also is that the clock on the wall, really, when it comes to your sleep, may not have that much meaning. And I like to describe it this way. So I'm definitely a morning person. I like to go to bed at 9:30, wake up between 4 and 5. For me, midnight is the middle of the night. Truly. In contrast, my youngest daughter, she's a night owl, and if left to her own devices, would like to go to bed at between 12:30 and 1 in the morning and sleep in till about 8 or 9. For her, midnight is not even the beginning of the night.
Yeah, just I think the way society is set up, it obviously gives preferential treatment, I think, to morning larks, right? You're due at work at a certain time, and that just can be really difficult for a lot of folks. And just we kind of see night owls, tend to be more at risk, for certain diseases, and so it's kind of I just would love to get to a place in our world where we're actually organizing our shifts at work, and people are able to be more aligned with kind of their natural preferences. And it just seems almost criminal, right, given what we know.
Let me back up here and say that your circadian clock and your chronotype actually profoundly affects your sleep need. What happens is that if you're a night owl, you can get into bed at 10 o'clock, but 10 o'clock for somebody who doesn't fall asleep because they're a night owl till much later, all that's going to do, if it takes you 2 to 3 hours to actually fall asleep, but you still have to wake up at 6, then you're not going to get your sleep need.
Right.
And the reverse is true too. So if you're a morning person, and that happens with a lot of players, because many of the games are at night. So evenings are for players are often very chaotic. They have a game going on, or they have other activities that they have to do. So they don't even get to bed on time. But because they're morning people, they tend to wake up early. And if that happens, then you're not going to meet your sleep need.
Yeah, and I think to your point earlier, I think the culture is starting to change. I think the awareness is increasing, and I think people are starting to recognize that short sleep is not helping productivity. And there's lots of really good data now to actually prove that that's in fact the case, that productivity actually declines by up to 10%, right? When you're, out of sync with your circadian rhythm. So yeah, hopefully there's change coming,
Yeah, I was going to say that, and that is, there are profound health, like we talked about cardiometabolic health effects of getting less sleep. But this is the culture that we live in, that we have to talk about productivity to get people to listen. Sleep is something deeply personal. It's deeply restorative. It's something that people do in their bedrooms. But people, the only way you can get people's attention is if you talk to them of how it affects their productivity the next day. Perhaps then they might make an effort to do that. And I think it's also a function of age. I mean, I remember as not hating naps and absolutely love them now.
Let's talk about age for a second. We know that a physiological signature of aging is that your sleep gets worse. Does sleep have to get worse as we age? Is there anything that we can do to kind of combat this?
Right. So some things naturally do happen. So the amount of deep sleep that you get tends to reduce as you get older. And what that means is that deep sleep, you're more difficult to arouse from deep sleep. My teenage son, when he's asleep, you can go and there could be elephant rampage going on. He's not going to wake up. I'm so jealous. That doesn't happen with us, right? But so because your sleep becomes more easily disrupted, you're likely to wake up. There's other things also as you get older, especially after retirement, people may be napping during the day. And then if you nap longer during the day, then you don't build up that sleep drive as much. They may have to get up to go to the bathroom. They may have, they may have aches and pains. So there are other factors that might be contributing to poor sleep. But poor sleep should not be considered as something that happens with everybody as you get older. If people are having poor sleep and as they're getting older, it's very important to seek help, because there's definitely things that can be done to help get their sleep better.
Right. And then there's of course the obvious stuff in terms of the sleep hygiene, and we talked about the anchors, in terms of light exposure at the right times, and meal timing, exercise, and sleep wake.
And perhaps we should take a few minutes. Remember, we didn't talk about that last bit, which is sleep quality. Sleep quality is just, it's a little bit difficult to define, but it's basically the ability to fall asleep within a reasonable amount of time and then stay asleep for 80 to 85% of the time you're in bed, and to wake up feeling refreshed. And then all these external things that you can do during the day and in your bedroom at night that might help you make sure that you get good quality of sleep. So, things like reducing caffeine intake, not drinking alcohol too close to your bedtime, which can, interrupt your sleep or disrupt especially your REM sleep.
We see that on the Whoop data. Holy cow.
Yes.
Alcohol is just crushing on every level, from recovery to obviously the fragmenting sleep.
Right. And then, or, making sure that the bedroom is cold and dark and quiet, or, electronic free. You want to, keep your bedroom for sleep or sex. Those are the only two things you want to be doing in your bedroom. And those are all things that you can do for good sleep habits or sleep hygiene.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to, as we're kind of talking about sleep quality, you kind of mentioned behaviors during the day that are really central. One of the things that, seems to really impact the quality of sleep is the degree to which you accumulate stress throughout the day. And I've heard you talk about worry time. And
Yes.
I think this might be, I think there's obviously a huge connection between sleep and mental health, clearly.
Right.
And quality sleep is kind of will really keep you psychologically healthy, right? From everything that you've said. So, talk maybe a little bit about, how to mitigate stress during the day with this kind of worry time strategy you have.
Right. Sleep and mental health is a bidirectional relationship. I mean, if you poor sleep worsens mental health issues are typically associated with poor sleep. And if you don't improve the sleep, mental health doesn't get better. In fact, just recently, I want to say in this last 1 month, there's this great meta-analysis that came out that showed that improving sleep improved every aspect of mental health. So they looked at depression, anxiety, etc. Every substance use, everything got better if you improve the quality of your sleep.
Yeah.
So that's number one. That's really, really important. The second thing so think about what happens at night. So, sleep is like a reset button, and it helps you prepare to face the stresses of the next day. And if you don't sleep very well, you're ill prepared. And if you don't face the stresses really well, that tends to make you more anxious, and that's going to make you sleep poorly. It's like a vicious cycle. And the best way to intervene is to try and improve your sleep. So that's the second point. But third, let's come to, your question. And what happens is that because we live very busy lives, people are on the go all the time. So sometimes when they get into bed, it's the first time they give themselves an opportunity to kind of think about the day.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not even consciously they're thinking about it. It's all these like thoughts come crowding in, and they're like all stressed out, and then they're I think I was telling you, I just recently was speaking to a head athletic trainer of an NFL team, and he's like, well, he gets home, he does thing, and then he gets into bed, and he's like working on his laptop, turns it off, and he's like, well, I have to sleep now. Well, that's not how sleep happens.
It's not going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Even an aeroplane, when it's about to land, it doesn't just like flop from the ground. It's not like going full speed and it's like, that's not.
There's a transition.
Yes, there is a transition. It decides, it's like circles around, like lowers its altitude, slowly comes down, and you want like a nice, really, really, soft landing. And so think about that, building in that landing time for your sleep in preparation of sleep. So it's like building a winding down. And the winding down has to be both physical as well as mental, in which you wind down. And
that's a good point.
So perhaps set an alarm. So if you think your bedtime should be 11:30, maybe at 10:45, an alarm that tells you, well, it's time to wind down. And winding down shouldn't.
Whoop actually has that little recommendation. You turn on your notification. Whoop will tell you to wind down. Yep.
Right.
Get ready
maybe a hot bath or a hot shower, some stretching exercises, spiritual or, meditation practices, reading a book or, something to help you quietly relax, and so that sleep can happen. Allow sleep to happen rather than command it to happen.
Yeah.
And then, of course, circling back to your original question, taking short, regular breaks during the day is really important, because otherwise you're going all the time. And, I'm going to tie two things together. You brought up presenteeism, which is, being present and work and spacing out, being on the internet or not being able to focus. That's because, you really can't keep going all the time. So for every 90 minutes and that again is individual, whatever time it takes, you can do focused work. You do need a few minutes of recovery to happen, so that you can sort of be prepared for the next 90 minutes of work, and perhaps do something quiet and relaxing in the mid-afternoon when you shouldn't be, you're incapable of that focused work. But also build a time earlier in the evening where perhaps you sit down with your iPad or with a piece of paper, or maybe perhaps when you're going for a walk, where you think about or strategize about your next day. Think about your worries, think about things that you have to, that which allows you time to actually give it some thought, and so that you've done it earlier during the day. Now, it is a practice that takes time. So I don't want people to think that they're going to do it one day and it's going to be It's going to, if you've taken years to build bad habits about your sleep, it's going to take you a while to build this
Right.
habit. I mean, patience is definitely a virtue here. You want
Yeah.
to, you want to take your time and just to kind of do it. Um, and I'll tell you another thing, and I find this when it comes to sleep, I think it's really important. I have to say that I tell this to every head coach or GM that I work with or a CEO I work with is that the buy-in often comes after you've started the behavior. You can't really, if you start, say, a meditation practice, whenever you start any behavior change, you sort of kind of commit to the behavior change. It takes a while. You see results. That those results happen, cause changes in your belief system and result in a buy-in. And that's when the buy-in happens. The behavior, the practice sometimes precedes the buy-in. Sometimes you really have to do something to build that buy-in. And sleep is a perfect example of that. Well, you're telling me to go to bed later and then you're going to do this, or you want me to take this 20-minute nap. How am I even supposed to do it?
Well, I love that you highlighted just this idea of, short breaks throughout the day to basically prevent that stress accumulation. And I think if people do just start there, they'll actually, I think, see an improvement in their ability to fall asleep at night because they're not, if you think about it from an autonomic nervous system perspective, when you're kind of hypervigilant throughout the day, you're activating the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, and as a result, you're just flooding the system with cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine, and it's just like it's hard to come down from that, right? But these mini moments of break, after a 90-minute focused task will allow you to re-engage your task, I think, with the level of focus, right? To prevent that presenteeism I'm talking about.
So let's just talk a little bit more about the naps just to give people an idea. Outdoors is better than indoors when it comes to those breaks. Not being on the phone or electronic free is better. Interacting with other people is better. Walking to the water cooler or taking a short walk outside and interacting with people, deciding that's the time you want to call your mother. Or
if that's a restful activity for you.
Yes, if that is a restful activity, well, those are the ways that you can build short times. And I will tell you that people will give you pushback and say they have to go all the time. And again, I always bring it back to working longer doesn't equate to working more effectively.
Right.
And to be effective, you have to build in those breaks into your day.
Our listeners ask a lot about, supplements and, sleep medications. Number one, are there any sleeping pills that can actually produce a naturalistic sleep?
So first of all, I'm a sleep medicine doctor, and I do prescribe.
That's why you're the perfect person to ask this question.
Yes, I do prescribe medications, and there are people who need sleep medication. So not to give all sleep medication a bad rep, but in fact, all sleep medications are usually they're indicated for a short period of time. So they're to help you acutely. Really, if you are having issues with sleep, the long-term way of dealing with it would be to do something called cognitive behavioral therapy or for insomnia, CBTI, which is a well-studied, well-researched branch in which you help with sleep issues. So and yes, you're right. All the sleep medications which cause sedation, they alter your sleep stages. So they're not. It's not the same thing as natural sleep. Sleeping in the wild, like sleeping without a pill. I would say if you think you need a sleep pill, you need to see a sleep doctor.
A lot of our members on the platform indicate that they use magnesium and melatonin. What are your thoughts on those two?
The thing about, say, for melatonin, which is, right now over the counter, there are a few things. So it's a normal, natural hormone. It strengthens nighttime physiology, which is sleep for us. And first of all, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine does not, this is not indicated for chronic people who have chronic insomnia. That is not what it helps with. It doesn't really help with poor sleep. There are correct ways of using it. Say if you were jet lagged you're trying to sleep at a different time zone, if you're a night owl, you're trying to go to bed early, etc. That would be the reason. Now, I don't want to give it a bad, it's relatively
Yeah.
safe, but it does have some side effects. Also, because it's over the counter, you really don't know what you're getting. Again,
I know.
and magnesium, like the data out there is, it's not compelling. A lot of people use it. Sometimes it helps for people who have, if they have leg cramping, and it might just help them sleep. But again, I always say, if you feel compelled to take medications or supplements to help you sleep, you want to absolutely explore that. Why are you having poor sleep? And you and I discussed this. I may be sleeping poorly because I have insomnia. I truly have insomnia, that which is difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep. You might be sleeping poorly because it's just not your bedtime. You're biologically, you're wired to go to bed at 1 in the morning, and you're trying to fall asleep at 10. Another person, Matt here, might be sleeping poorly because he's on the phone and playing video games at night, and and then he's trying to fall asleep, so he's all wound up. And other people may be sleeping with a loud partner who keeps them awake. So unless you explore the exact reason why somebody is sleeping poorly, you really can't a medication is not going to treat any of them. You really want to find out exactly, which is why, wearing a Whoop or something, that helps, because then you can look back at the data, you can try to make correlations of what had happened at that night, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then
you can ask better questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Your data. Yeah. If you just kind of back in, just as a summary, like if we're to look at sleep quality, okay, what are what's the most profound behavior we can grasp onto that will help drive sleep quality? And we'll just kind of go down the list here real quick.
Things that you do during the day really profoundly affect
so there's mini breaks.
Right. So during the day, you want to be exposed to bright light. You want to have a schedule. A schedule is really good because it sort of anchors your day. You want to build in short breaks during the day, and you want to build in that worry time. And then leading up to the time that you're going to go to sleep, you want to have that winding down schedule that sort of helps you, that prepares you for sleep. But really, 3 simple things, if you do, really will profoundly affect the quality of your sleep. Number 1 is to be cognizant of how much caffeine you're drinking and how close to your bedtime you're drinking that caffeine.
Yeah.
That really happens. That really is really helpful. Number 2 is alcohol or nicotine. So alcohol and nicotine, they're both going to disrupt your sleep at night. If you drink it too close to your bedtime, or if you're chewing tobacco or smoking right before your bedtime, it's going to impair the quality of your sleep. And number 3 is light exposure. And I cannot tell you how important it is, because it's really, it's the interactiveness, it's playing video games, and of course with the teams I work with, if there's a players playing on video games at night, they're playing with other players. So they're not only keeping themselves awake, they're keeping other people, other players
teammates.
Or reaching for your phone in the middle of the night to check the phone, and then like going down that rabbit hole of like going on to social media. Those 3 simple things, if you can please start there, I think that your sleep will be better.
Yeah, and just to double click on the light piece, there's some literature out there that basically says, any light exposure between, and please correct me if this is not accurate, but any light exposure between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., you actually blunt or mute the release of serotonin next day.
Yeah, you have to just be mindful of how much light is being exposed, what you're doing with that light,
and a lot of what you mentioned about quality, I think, applies to consistency. So, and your ability to actually fall asleep at your preferred time is very much dictated by the morning light you're getting.
Right.
And
I don't know how much time we have, but that is kind of an important thing. Consistency is important, because what people do is, during the weekday, because their sleep time is dictated by their work. So they may go to bed at a certain time and wake up, and then on the weekend, because now they don't have to be anywhere, they go to bed like 4 hours later, and then sleep in for another, till about noon. And if you do that on a regular basis, that inconsistency itself has significant cardiometabolic effects. And so you want to try to be consistent. Your wake up time really shouldn't vary by more than an hour or so.
So is there anything that you feel like we kind of missed that you're like dying to kind of tell our listeners about?
I would say that everything improves if you improve sleep. There is not a single thing that doesn't improve with better sleep. It really, really doesn't. Your relationships, the way that you function, your interaction with your children, with, other people, the way that you're exercising, the way that you're metabolizing whatever you're taking in. Like, there is nothing that does not improve with better sleep.
Well, that seems like a really good place to end. Dr. Singh, where can folks find you and the work that you do?
So I do have a website, mitasinghmd.com. And then I do. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram. And yes, if you can just link those. I think like Twitter is kind of amazing. All the sleep people that you can interact with. I think LinkedIn is kind of amazing too.
Oh, it's amazing. I love following your work on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And as I do yours. So those are the ways to get in touch with me.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Singh, it's been such a pleasure. You are just a treasure trove of insight and wisdom. And I know our listeners are going to really appreciate the level of depth that you provided here today. And just thank you for all your good work.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a platform.
Thank you to Dr. Singh for coming on the Whoop Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop Podcast, please be sure to leave us a rating or review. Don't forget to subscribe to the Whoop Podcast. You can check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. And don't forget, you get 15% off a Whoop membership if you use the code WILL, WILL. Okay, folks, that's it for now. We'll be back next week. Stay healthy, stay in the green.